Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding and today I am joined by Jacob Rennaker, who many of you who listen to this podcast will know is a frequent conversation partner for me as we discuss all things fantasy. And today we thought we would actually take a bit of a dig back into the history of C.S. Lewis. In particular, we would look at the connected topic of his work, The Discarded Image, Planet Narnia, and the Narnia series. So bear with us. If that doesn't mean anything to you, then hold on because it's going to be a revelation. And for those of you who already have an inkling about this topic, you hopefully will enjoy the conversation that we're about to have. So, Jacob, welcome. Do you want to kick off
Thank you.
by saying what this is, the discarded image? What do we mean when I say C.S. Lewis and the discarded image?
Right. So the discarded image is essentially a reification of his set of lectures that he provided, that he gave at university about the medieval cosmos, the model of the medieval cosmos. And so when he says the discarded image, it's the kind of mental picture, the imaginative framework that the medieval authors that he was a specialist in had in mind when they were discussing everything, the world around them, theology, nature, sciences, everything is kind of undergirded by this kind of imaginative image. And it's this image that in modernity that he says that we have discarded, set aside. And so his attempt here is to kind of rehabilitate this image to help to introduce it to show modern audience, modern readers, what this would have looked like and felt like to experience for a medieval and the value that it still holds to people today.
Yeah, so you have to imagine that C.S. Lewis gave this first as a series of lectures, as Jacob said. He was faced with rows upon rows of students who were pitching up at Oxford and then Cambridge, who had come with a modern mindset of science. Things had been set out into space. They knew how big the universe was, or had an inkling of it anyway. I think it's got bigger since. Um, and he felt there was a need to give them a guide to how people before the modern times thought, because so much was being missed when students were reading medieval literature. And towards the end of his life, he compiled these lectures into a book called The Discarded Image. Rather poignantly, the prologue is written in 1962 and the book is published in 1964. And 1963, the intervening year, is the year in which he dies. So it's very much something that comes out right at the end of his career. Okay, so that was the purpose of this book. Just so you can sort of feel what it's like to read. It is a scholarly book, and there are large chapters on things like the Latin writers that the medievals were reading, who aren't on any present day bestseller list. People like Plotinus, Boethius, who I think is probably, I certainly knew a bit more about him. Um, and then there were sort of the old faves like Aristotle and others' description of the Greek writers like Plato and so on. So he does the Greeks, he does the Latins, and tries to show the continuity between those writers and the medievals who then pick them up uh, in the period which he was teaching in. So if you skip those chapters, the nub of the argument comes in the beginning material and the epilogue at the end. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on. So, Jacob, do you want to have a stab at describing what the medieval universe was like?
This is fascinating. It took Lewis a number of different lectures, so I don't think I can do it in any
No.
shorter of a time than he did. But I'll try. So just kind of the 20,000 to 30,000 foot view is uh, a kind of intricately woven, carefully planned, interconnecting set of heavenly bodies, earthly bodies, all governed by by God essentially, but with layers, levels that all relate to each other in different ways, but that are all firmly interconnected and like I said, interwoven. And it's organized. You can label everything. Everything has its proper place. Everything makes sense. It's a given that things are going to make sense. There's a reason and rationale for it all. And the medieval mind, as Lewis says, enjoyed this sort of categorization and this sort of complexity. And just contemplating this model was something that authors that really kind of sparked them and drove them so that they didn't see repetition of the model of trying to re-explain it as being something that would be dull to them. Rather, it was something that they thought that they looked upon with a sense of joy and delight, and that if they could, recapitulate this model, they could explore it. They could kind of detailed the interconnection between these different parts, that was something that delighted them and presumably delighted their audience. That the reason why Lewis says that they spoke about this model so much was because they enjoyed it so much, and that might be a difference. It wasn't a sense for a drive for novelty. Rather, it was a sense of kind of like comfort, not just comfort, but like really deep appreciation for, respect for, and kind of an enlivening by these sort of principles that stood as fundamental. So you can see everything. Everything is explainable, and you can enjoy it again and again. And there's always more to kind of see and understand, but it's all there. It's all laid out. You just have to remember it.
I think one of it's a kind of instinctive version of the universe. So if you imagine us standing outside looking up at the skies, this model of the universe, which goes back to the Greeks, and probably before that, starts with the idea of the Earth is not exactly at the center, but it's at the bottom. And then above that are the spheres. And the spheres are all the seven planets, and the moon is counted as a planet in their separate spheres. So you've got the moon, um, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Jupiter, not the very outer layer planets like Uranus, because they weren't yet discovered. So you've got seven of them sort of stacked up. And then beyond that, you've got the fixed stars. And beyond that, you've got the sort of prime mover, because they understood that in order for the spheres to be revolving, there had to be something to set them in motion. The other thing was that it was felt that this was like a eternal universe. They didn't have a sense of it being created. Um, that was the Greek version of it. Of course, by the time you get to the medieval version, they've got the idea of the Christian worldview of there being a creation moment. So there were some dissonance between what Christianity had entered into the model and what the Greek scientists had. Anyway, so that we don't need to go into the minute detail, but there are some absolutely brilliant descriptions. This is why I was so excited to talk to Jacob about it, because he'd also been reading it. And there's some fantastic descriptions of what it's like to be a medieval person looking up at the universe. I've just got a couple here I want to read to you. So, hence, to look out on the night sky with modern eyes is like looking out over a sea that fades away into mist, or looking about one in a trackless forest, trees forever and no horizon. To look up the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilderment or vague reverie. The spheres of the old present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness, but satisfying in its harmony. That is the sense in which our universe is romantic and theirs was classical. So that goes back to you were saying, Jacob, that they had this model which they celebrated and found they wanted to illustrate and add to and explore because it was like being in a vast, wonderful medieval cathedral, um, a known kind of understandable place in a sense, as opposed to us now with the proportions of the universe being so vast that we feel lost in a trackless forest, as C.S. Lewis says here. When you were reading this, did it help you do the adjustment, which is aiming for, which is to sort of feel a bit medieval as you were reading it?
Yeah, one of the things, these perspective shifts that he provides, and he does it three different times in
Mm.
Discarded Image. He asks the audience reader he says the best way to get a sense for this is to actually go out in the night sky, to spend half an hour just looking up at the stars. Like you were mentioning, Julia, that it's really kind of this intuitive looking up and really getting a feel for what it's like. So then you can start playing imaginatively. Like, what are these? Is it, you know, in the ancient Near Eastern, Mediterranean view, you have the sky as a dome, and light as being either gems, jewels, or pinpricks that are kind of showing through to something else beyond. And so, if you sit with that, once you kind of enter into that model and try to look at what that's like, it can be disorienting in a way, and that's what I think what Lewis is trying to encourage: disorientation, or for him it would be kind of a reorientation that the world needed to understand that yes, it's he used the term vertiginous, right? He says the medieval model is vertiginous. If you look at it the right way, you're not actually looking up, you're actually looking down, you're looking out into this the more real world, and so to try to shift that perspective, that's interesting. And yeah, and there's I've actually had there was a point actually to your question, right? Have I tried this? Have I experienced that? There was, I remember I had read Out of the Silent Planet, where you have kind of a description. I know we'll move into this a little bit later, but he describes the space versus the heavens, talking, and he talks about this here in the Discarded Image, that space is what we call what's outside of the world, and that is the opposite of what the medieval mind would have described space as. Instead of empty, vacuous, cold, dark, the medieval mind looks at this as bright, full of song, light, warmth, and he illustrates this in Out of the Silent Planet at one point. And I remember I just read that. I was at the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, and was there, and they had a great view of the city, but it was it must have been nearly full moon. It was enormous, and as I was standing there, kind of just looking out at that. There's lots of people around, but I was just captivated by the moon, and it just seemed like after having read this, Lewis's description of what it felt like to be or experience space or imagine space, it was for me. So there was kind of a switch that flipped, and the moon seemed to be like something that was living, or at least worthy of love, and that wasn't at a distance, but it was close enough for me to see and almost feel, in a sense. So imaginatively, I felt like I could say I loved the moon in a way that I wasn't able to say before, because seeing it just as a hunk of rock that's orbiting however many million, however many miles away from Earth, and this is what its rotation. It is a thing rather than it is an object. It is something to be reflected and upon and contemplated. That's really what Lewis is trying to do here, is to shift our view from just seeing things as things, seeing a star. And this is something, again, as we're going into how he illustrates this, but in his fiction, which Tolkien does in his poem Mythopoeia as well. And you see some kind of interplay between what Lewis is doing here and what Tolkien is seeing, kind of the conversations that they were having. He's trying to broaden our view from the kind of modern view of examining and applying taxonomy to different items and saying, okay, I know what this is because these are the parts that make it up, and this is kind of how it functions within the laws of physics. Moving from that to a world that is moved ultimately by love. And that's something that I found incredibly moving and even kind of like personally meaningful as I was kind of playing with those sort of experiments myself.
Yeah, and I think what I really appreciate about the discarded image is he's trying to say, look, these weren't ignorant people, the medievals. They were very sophisticated in the way they used this model. So he takes you through the thought experiment after having put us, in a sense, at the bottom or in the center of this, with the spheres going around us. He says they also understood that we were outside the city wall, that God, the first mover, the ultimate, we are the furthest away. So he suddenly flips the model and he said, this is what the medievals did. They were able to hold this sophisticated image of being both in the center and on the outside at the same time. So this gets away from the rather tired uh, cliche that there wasn't really science in medieval period and they spent all their time debating whether or not angels danced on pinheads, that stuff, and says actually no, they knew it was a model. They knew it was the best guess that they had at the time, but they were also able to do these interesting things with it to explore their beliefs and the way they understood their beliefs by incorporating it into this classical model that they'd inherited from, well, the Greeks, really. So let's move to the epilogue of the discarded image, because that gets really interesting, because there he really confronts our modern age. He's obviously writing a few decades before us now, but he was in a time when we have the beginning of, Einstein and special relativity and general relativity and the quantum world. And so he is in a sort of, in a sense, in a world of modern science. Um, and he goes on to point out some really fascinating things about our current scientific models. So I like this in particular. Anything imaginable, even anything that can be manipulated by ordinary, that is, non-mathematical conceptions, far from being a further truth to which mathematics was the avenue, is a mere analogy, a concession to our weakness. So he's saying that science has reached a point now where when mathematicians, who are the ones who speak the language of science, try and explain it, they give us an analogy, but it's nowhere, it's the distance from what they're trying to describe is vast. So take for something like the string theory, which you and I may have a sort of vague idea. Well, it's about strings of things, but that's not at all. It's just a sort of something to stand between us and the science. It's not actually access to what the scientists themselves are discussing. We have to acknowledge that our understanding of science by analogy, we use models that are flawed. We're not truer. We're just using flaws, a flawed model, which is a kind of explanation. And so he sums this up by saying, no model is a catalogue of ultimate realities, and none is mere fantasy. So there's some truth in all of them. Each reflects the prevalent psychology of an age almost as much as it reflects the state of that age's knowledge. Nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions we ask her. And then he has a final image, which I find really helpful. He says that our questions are like a stencil. It determines how much of the total truth will appear and what pattern it will suggest. So if we go to science or go to nature asking certain questions, we get back certain answers. Um, I found this really, really thought provoking actually, because I'm very interested in science and I do try and understand science, which is above my pay grade mathematically. And I do sort of rest on these analogies, thinking I'm understanding, but he's warning me that I'm kind of not. So I mustn't look down on the medievals because they were doing a damn fine job in their own terms with their model.
Yeah, this is great. And what he says, yeah, and I like how he begins the epilogue that you mentioned there. It says, I've made no serious effort to hide the fact that the old model delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to have combined splendor, sobriety, and coherence in the same degree. So there's appreciation for it. It is possible that some readers have long been itching to remind me that it had a serious defect. It was not true, right? So so this is a great way with kind of traditional, Lewisian kind of wit and humor. He says like, I know this is not true, right? But I want to say that this does, even though it's not true in that sense that it accurately describes how contemporary astrophysics understands the workings of the cosmos. It still holds a kind of permanent value, imaginative value, and for him, he saw it as well as having a spiritual or moral value in contemplating this model, and they should be held alongside other models, right? Not to be looked down upon as, looking at history. The term that Lewis uses is exercising chronological snobbery, to say, kind of discarding everything that happened before because history is kind of a one long line of progression, and that we are now, in our knowledge, in our morals, in our understanding, that we're far superior today than anyone that existed before. Kind of try to say that that's not the appropriate way to look at this. Each person, each age has its own kind of way of engaging with the world that deserves to be taken seriously, and held kind of in conversation, intention, not just intention with, but I think he would say like in conversation with
Mm.
these other models, and that it's in that conversation of these different models that you're arriving closer to what is ultimately real, and what is actually meaningful.
So fortunately, we're not about to set off in a rocket ship, so we don't need to have the right. We're using this imaginatively and as an inspiration. But if you're wanting to understand really hundreds and hundreds of years of literature, it's a very good book just to give you a sort of, primer on that. And also it links to the idea of the humours, which was the main kind of medical knowledge until very recently, really, until we got germ theory and other things. And you've probably heard of the sort of the choleric temper and melancholy and all these things, sanguine. This all comes from the planets, their influence, and how that affects our bodies. Because the medics were trying to explain why we get ill, why people were different from other people, why people went into depression, all these things they look for explanations, and they connect it to this model. So if you want to understand how people understood character, it's a great book to read just to put that in your head. So when you read your Shakespeare plays, you know what's going on, for example. Anyway, so let's move on from the discarded image to briefly look at how Lewis played with this himself. He says right at the beginning, he hopes to persuade the reader not only that this model of the universe is a supreme medieval work of art, which I think you mentioned, Jacob, but that it is in a sense the central work, that which most particular works were embedded, to which they constantly referred, from which they drew a great deal of their strength. So everything goes back to this all the time. And recently, or in the last 10 years or so, scholarship about C.S. Lewis has suggested that this is really true of his own fiction and his own writing. And it's very much front and center in his poem, The Planets, which in itself is like a little primer to understand the seven heavens of the medieval um, imagination. But it also goes into his Ransom trilogy, the science fiction trilogy set in space, and also the Narnian. What's the word for a seven-part book?
He called well, Ward calls it the Narniad, like
The
the
Narnia.
Iliad, which
There we go.
I kind of like the Narniad.
Okay, so so I would just recommend reading the short poem. I mean, not that short, but the poem "The Planets," which is in the collected poems of C.S. Lewis, because it's going to be very key to the next place we're going with this, which is Michael Ward. Now, Michael Ward is an academic who lives and works in Oxford. I had dinner with him last week, so he's very much
Oh,
around on the scene. He's a delightful man, but he also happens to be the the person who I'd say has revolutionized the way we think about C.S. Lewis in our generation. And this was all because he was sitting reading The Planets, the poem The Planets. So do you want to pick up the story there, Jacob, and say what revelation came to Michael?
yeah, so he's reading that he's doing work on Lewis, and in reading there's a passage from the this poem about Jupiter that mentions in talking about the sense the essence of Jupiter, that it's of um, the sense of winters ended and sins forgiven. And so those two lines together, winter ended, sins forgiven, or wrongs forgiven, then that kind of immediately sparks his mind to make a connection between the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where you have right your always winter, never Christmas, and then Edmund and his kind of betrayal, and then Aslan's kind of making restitution for that, and ultimately forgiving him. So that seems to be kind of the impetus, the spark that kind of reframes things for him. And so he starts looking, rereads again the poem itself, and now then goes to look at the different volumes within the Narniad, to see if there was a correspondence. So first, within Lions, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, how much Jupiter imagery do we see there? And then he finds he demonstrates quite a bit that he finds there, and says, well, if that is the case for the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, is it also true for these other planets? And there are seven planets in essence here, and seven heavenly bodies, I should say. And then there's seven Narnia novels, and there's been traditionally scholars have had a difficult time trying to provide some sort of overarching schema for understanding how do these fit together. What is the organizing principle of these books? Is it just slapdash, as Tolkien had described it? Right? Is this just Lewis just kind of in the dark, firing off shots, grabbing pieces of mythology from here and there, that Tolkien found to be inconsistent mythological systems? What is Lewis doing? And scholars have tried a number of different ways, mapping them onto the seven Catholic sacraments, mapping them onto different plays. Ward even says that he tried making connections between different Shakespearean plays, which he finds allusions to, but there wasn't any satisfying overarching model for understanding why seven books, how do they actually fit together. And so yeah, so this poem and this reading through specifically of Jupiter is what kind of sends him off into this deep dive into Lewis's planetary imagination, or heavenly body medieval imagination, and then looking at how those ideas might have been embodied in the different books of the Narnia series.
Yeah, I'm so probably, I mean, Michael is putting it out there for us to challenge him. And I guess the one challenge would be the stencil image that C.S. Lewis provides, that if we put the stencil of the planets on the books, then we get the answers back we're looking for. Okay. But still, I find it very enriching. So that's an argument for going along with this argument. So Jove, Jupiter, jovial, happy, rejoicing, the greatest of the planets is the Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Um, but it is quite convincing, particularly the association with the silver chair and Luna, the moon, madness, water, wateriness, enchantment. and there's silver. There's all sorts of imagery there that works well with the medieval understanding of Luna. Um, you've got Mercury, messenger, fleet-footed messenger for the horse and his boy, because the whole point of that story is to get the message to Narnia that the Calamans are coming across the desert. But there are many other aspects to this, languages, all sorts of things, cross-cultural aspects. Um, oh, Mars, Prince Caspian, all about war, battles, single combat, fighting. It's you can see once you start looking for it. Yes, absolutely. That is the book about war. Um, we've so who have we got left? We got Venus.
Yeah.
Yes,
Magician's Nephew is Venus. Yeah.
yeah. Now that one I find less of a close fit.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, okay, I'm happy to go with it. I'm still convinced, Michael. And then of course the last one is uh Saturn, which is the last battle. Oh no, I've missed out the sun. Well, so the sun one is the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The sun imagery in that um, is and gold, which everyone remembers the bit in the water where people turn into gold statues. I mean, there is lots of, yeah, I find that convincing. The imagery on board the ship, it sort of picks up the solar theme. And then going back to Saturn, the old man, the end of times, the closing up the shop on Narnia. It's the sort of the aged one. Everything is in its last days in that story. So yeah, I do find the theme convincing and enriching. And I'd read the books as a child, read them as an adult, read Michael's book Planet Narnia, and then reread or listened again to the stories and found new depths, new possibilities of imagery coming through. So for me, that's the point of reading a critic like this, is you can suddenly see a richer theme by thinking, that's possible. So are you totally sold on the theory, or do you have reservations?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like you said, going back to Lewis, that it's a model for understanding the Narnia books. I think you're right. I absolutely agree that Ward has produced enough evidence
Mm,
and ideas there to make a convincing argument that this was something that could have been in Lewis's mind. And more importantly than whether or not this was actually what motivated it, it is a valuable lens through which you can see these books and that you can draw deeper appreciation for what Lewis is doing. So at the very least, if it wasn't the governing principle of the Narnia books, it certainly seems to be something that was part of, as we discussed with the discarded image. This was something that was kind of fundamental to Lewis's thought and way of kind of toying with what the world is, how do things work together. He loved the medieval model, and so it makes sense that he would that even if it wasn't intentional, that love for an engagement with that model would inevitably kind of bleed into what he's doing with his fiction, and it seems to be doing it. He seems to be doing it. He seems to be doing it. He's kind of explicitly doing that in the Ransom,
yeah.
the Cosmic Trilogy. You definitely have the names of the planets. It's much more explicit, so you can see him doing it there. And so we know that he's capable of treating those sort of themes and wanted to engage with those ideas of heavenly bodies, translating them into fiction, entering into a fictional world in which these planetary ideas and ideals were a reality and you were able to experience them, or the characters in the story were able to experience them. So I think that's a good argument for saying, like, yes, this is Lewis is capable of doing this. Is he doing that in some way here in the Narnia books? And it seems like it would be difficult to say that it wasn't in his mind, or he was able to shut
Yeah.
off that part of his mind while he was writing these books. But it does certainly add some unique, I think, enriching perspective on the Narnia stories.
And of course, there is that material at the end of the Dawn Treader where they meet a retired star, Ramandu. And dear old Eustace, one of my fave characters of all the time, basically says, "Oh, you can't be a star. You know, stars are a big ball of burning gas." And his answer, Ramanju's answer is, "Well, that's what a star is in your world. In this world, this is what stars are like. I'm a star." So the what C.S. Lewis is doing is you're in a world of fantasy. So this can be the model of the universe. Stars can be different. It can be the medieval version of some sort of wonderful angelic being, a sort of demon of the skies, demon spelled not demonic, but the sort of presence in the skies, who can be a retired star living on an island. Why not? You're in the world of fantasy, and it's real within that world of fantasy. So I think, yes, there's plenty of evidence in there. So the biggest problem is the one which Michael Ward does tackle, which is why didn't he tell us? So once he'd finished writing the Narnia series, why didn't he leave a letter saying, "Hey, everybody, I've been super clever. Look how clever I've been. This is the answer to all those critics who told me I was being random. Tolkien, you should have paid more attention." You know, why didn't he do that? What do you think about Michael's answer, which is
Yeah, that
basically that C.S. Lewis liked to set the puzzles and he liked to have it sort of the surprise of unfolding it?
yeah. So I think if we were writing a novel about C.S. Lewis writing his stories, then I think that's compelling, right? That's like the Da Vinci Code. This is the Narnia, and actually, one of the popular versions that Ward did was called this the Narnia Code, right? So it's
Hmm.
this thrilling discovery that there's a secret key to re-examine these things that have been in plain sight all along, and really is teaching about X, Y, or Z. So there's something that it, for us, kind of like narratively as humans, we find that compelling. And this is a mystery to solve, but you're right. It's an argument from silence, and that's the hardest argument to make, right? That he, yeah, that was the part that was kind of least convincing to me, was that Lewis could be a secretive person. He kind of kept his marriage to Joy a secret for a year or so from a lot of his closest friends, and that there were other things in his life that he didn't document in Surprised by Joy in his autobiography, that some who knew him felt were kind of glaring omissions. So yes, he was secretive, maybe just private about certain things. But again, yeah, to say the argument I think that I find most compelling for that Ward makes for Lewis's silence about his model, or his own kind of impetus for writing these works of fiction, is that, again, going back to how Lewis was studying medieval literature, and so he uses, draws the comparison of the Knight's Tale in Chaucer, that Mars imagery kind of pervades it, and then it's explicitly stated that it happens, things resolve on a Tuesday, which is the day of Mars in the calendar. And so Lewis is, pointing out and recognizing in Discarded Image that medievals are infusing their works, even imaginative works, with this imagery. And so if he is trying to emulate, trying to get into the mode and model of the medieval mind, then to have this happening himself, that he would just presume that the medievals didn't say, now I'm going to be writing about Jupiter. They just assumed that in the audience. So if he's taking the same approach, and he calls it, and Ward points us out, this kind of the kappa element. It's this element within fiction that is kind of the guiding theme or principle. It provides the atmosphere for a work of fiction, and that is something that kind of is the air that you breathe in that given work. And so, to if you're in the air, you don't I don't recognize that I'm breathing air because I'm breathing it so much. And then to do so is to kind of ruin it, to kind of take you out of that mode of suspension of belief, or to draw attention to the fact that you are in a particular model, that it is something that needs to be just kind of breathed and experienced. So that's, I think, that's probably the most compelling argument that Ward makes. It's not entirely, like you said, Julia, it's not entirely convincing. You can't, it's not ironclad. You can't say, yes, he did this, and that he was a secret person and that he meant for this. And he's just giggling somewhere on the other side that finally somebody has discovered this. It's hard to say it's hard to say that why he wouldn't have mentioned it. He does have a Ward brings up a couple of different references that Lewis may have been alluding to this, but again, it's allusions and a lack of explicit calling out this imagery. So it's difficult, but it doesn't invalidate the idea. I think the core thesis that the medieval model of the heavens and the spheres played a part in Lewis's construction of the Narnia books.
Yeah, and also I wonder if we're looking at it a bit round the wrong way, in that he's not setting a puzzle for academics, he's writing books for children. And just as when he thought about the Ransom trilogy, he was thinking, what fun can I have for adult readers of science fiction to familiarize themselves with the medieval model in certain aspects? He's thinking, what fun can I have for children in bathing them in the atmosphere of a sort of a medieval concept of the heavens? I mean, there is another organizing principle which is more obvious, which is the creation to revelation structure of the Narnia series. So you go from, not in order they were written, but in when you put them all together, you've got the sort of foundation stories of the creation of Narnia. Then you've got the Golden Age period, which is Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and a bit of Prince Caspian and the Dawn Treader. And then you've got the sort of undoing and the Silver Age and the end of Narnia. So there is another kind of more obvious organizing principle, and I think he was drawing on um, what he loved. We also are used to Easter eggs now, aren't we, in films and what have you. I put them in my own books that I will connect characters which I'm not expecting anybody else to recognize, but I'm just doing it for my own pleasure because I see connections between characters. I might import them into another book, or there'll be these webs which I'm creating, and I feel that you don't need to expose the workings in order to have the effect, the enjoyable effect of what that adds up to. So, yeah. So, should we move briefly to the Ransom trilogy and its application of the discarded image? Do you want to explain a little bit about Out of Silent Planet when this is most obvious that he's using the medieval model?
For me, yeah, it is a space travel book, and this is just to provide a greater context. This was a book that he wrote as a result of a conversation that he had with J.R.R. Tolkien, right? That they were kind of lamenting the state of science fiction. They thought that the science fiction books weren't as good as they should be or could be, and so they decided one of them would tackle time travel, the other one would tackle space travel. Tolkien started working out some ideas, never finished anything because it ended up kind of getting subsumed into his larger project, and it was too difficult for him to kind of work into his larger legendarium. Whereas Lewis went out and he was able to do, I think it was much easier for Lewis to do kind of one-off projects that didn't have to be all part and connected to a larger whole. So Lewis is looking at space travel as a trope for science fiction, and so in the actual space travel portion of the book, when Ransom, the main character, is kind of kidnapped and then taken in space to the planet Mars. The silent planet is Earth. Mars has every planet has a different name, and he's providing it is truly interesting, right? How he's taking medieval model and kind of recasting it as a science fiction premise of different worlds under different governing systems, kind of an interplanetary council uh, so for me, where I see it really, where it kind of initiates you into the medieval mode is during the when Ransom is taken from Earth to Mars, to Malacandra, the planet that is Mars essentially, but in this world, it's called Malacandra. But as Ransom is kind of sitting, looking out into space, he has this an extended, beautiful kind of revelatory moment for the character. And he said, "Can I read just a little portion
Mm.
of that here to give that?" So he says, a nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science was falling off of him. So this is his kind of like shedding this view that modern science has put on him. So it continues. It says he had read of quote space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness, which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much of it affected him until now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this Empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly, even upon earth, with so many eyes. And here, with how many more? No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser, and so this is his again allusion to
Mm.
medieval thinkers. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declared the glory. So this is another reference to Psalm 19. The happy climes that he says, where day never shuts his eye, up in the broad fields of the sky. He quoted Milton's words to himself lovingly at this time and often. So you have him making a few different cross references to other works that he does. Of course, Lewis writing his preface to Paradise Lost, so as a Milton scholar, to Psalm 19 there as a kind of a biblical scholar, as well as the medieval model there. So this kind of changing of view of space isn't quote space, that's the wrong way to look at this. There's another way of experiencing it, and I just love the language that he uses there, seeing the sky, the heavens, as a kind of the womb of worlds, this nurturing, creating creative environments. So that's kind of what gets you to kind of shift your way of thinking, and then once you actually get to the planet, he's exploring different races of creatures, but ultimately there's conflict there, and there's conflict that the people from Earth are bringing to that planet. And so that I didn't find in that much with Out of the Silent Planet that this kind of Martian imagery, this Mars, like that wasn't necessarily like permeating this whole book, but ultimately you have Ransom interacting with the kind of intelligence or governing creature, or you might say kind of an angel-like creature that kind of governs this planet. That's where you kind of get a sense for what the embodiment of Mars is. But for the rest of the book, it's largely kind of exploring ideas that he explores elsewhere in his, Christian apologetic work, um, uh, in more imaginative terms. But more than that, again, these medieval ideas are kind of at play in the background, providing a kind of soundtrack for some of this as it continues.
Yeah, so the through thread for the trilogy is the idea that Earth is the silent planet, the fallen planet is another way of putting it. Um, and each planet is sort of governed by a spirit, an angel, a genius of place. It's that sort of sense. And the one on Earth is devilish and bad and corrupt. And so we are an object of pity in the solar system. So when we move to Perilandra, which is actually a book with not that much plot, but amazing world building. Perilandra is Venus, so unsurprisingly, the presiding genius of the place is a female, beautiful sort of presence, and again, you've got the idea of Ransom comes as an emissary because he's learnt lessons from Outer Silent Planet. He's there, he discovers to prevent a fall. He's been sent to stop the corruption from that he's experienced on Earth reaching this planet as it sort of takes its first steps. So that's the sort of broad outline of that. It's amazing the creation of a or the evocation of a world where land masses are balanced on water is amazing. Just reading it for that, it's very, very striking. And then finally, the last book, That Hideous Strength, is based on Earth. And I've just read it, reread it recently. It's a strange book. But if you've got the sort of masculine world of the first book and a feminine world of the second book, Michael Ward was saying to me when I was talking to him about this book and the struggles I had with it, he said, well, actually, it's the reconciliation of the male and female. So less reliant on the discarded image, except it's importing this imagery of there being spiritual beings at war in our universe who are fighting over the future. So let's leave the space trilogy there because I think it might be worth returning to that hideous strength in particular at a later date because it's such a bizarre story. Shall we think finally about the implications of what C.S. Lewis is up to? Can you think of any other writers who have used scientific models, discarded ones or not, to underwrite their fantasy?
Yeah, there's one particular book, an author, Ted Chiang, who he wrote the short story that the film Arrival was based on, right? Kind of first contact between an alien species and having to kind of figure out a what their language system is and how that works, right? So it was I enjoyed it as a film. The short story is incredible as well. What Chang does in his short stories kind of collection called Stories of Your Life and Others, he explores a few different models. One of which is the Babylonian model. So in the short story Tower of Babylon, he kind of takes seriously the Babylonian construction of the world and somebody kind of walking up the Tower of Babel. But you have him taking the physics of what a model like that would mean and like actually putting that into a story. So it was a really fascinating experience. Again, reading it to say like, okay, this is a sort of science fiction that's based on the scientific, quote, scientific understanding or conceptualization of that particular time period. So that's one author that I've seen play with some of these different models, kind of cosmological models in fiction, in short story, not in like long form, but in short story. And I think they're perfect for short story kind of thought experiments. It's really a great medium for that.
In longer form, I can think of some. The three body problem. So I apologize to those of you who can speak Chinese, but the three body problem by Liu Cixin, Cixin. Sorry, please educate me on the right pronunciation. That is fascinating exploration of how to describe a digital universe, like computing. Some of the sort of dreamlike sequences in this other culture they're interacting with are incredibly memorable with the sort of periods of time they go through. Anyway, if you've seen the Netflix series, you'll know what I'm talking about, but the book is also brilliant. And then, of course, Frankenstein. Frankenstein is Mary Shelley's thinking about the new science of electricity, plus pondering the claims of alchemists. So the sort of combination of what was the cutting edge science of her day with this older alchemy that was an exploded science by the time she was thinking about it, a discarded image in that case. And then the final one I thought of was, of course, is Philip Pullman, who he in the Northern Lights series is thinking about dark matter. And I actually heard him talk about this in a panel in Oxford. And he was actually, there was a physicist on the panel talking about the real science. And I remember poor old Philip Pullman saying, well, of course, I am just turning it into fantasy. I'm not trying to be a scientist, when he was sort of challenged on some of the bits that aren't quite right for science. So we must always say, when an author like C.S. Lewis or Philip Pullman or Mary Shelley puts these things into fantasy, what they're doing is having fun and applying the model, but they're not actually held to, rigorous scientific standards, because that's a different profession. Yes, perhaps we should put some links in our show notes to the books we've mentioned so people can look it up. So let's finish, Jacob. We've gone round the medieval universe. So where in all the fantasy world is the best place, do you think, to live in a medieval universe?
I would think I will say, just because I just finished reading it, and I don't want to take more time deliberating in my own mind. I just finished reading DC Comics. They have a kind of a mini series, a 12-issue mini series called Dark Knights of Steel. And it's a medieval reworking, essentially, of the kind of DC mythology,
Oh,
your
wow.
core characters in a medieval world. So it kind of takes as the starting point is, what if Superman had crash landed in medieval Europe somewhere, without saying where exactly. But it wasn't just Superman landing there. His parents also accompanied him. So you have these characters kind of being set up as kind of god kings, and their people, their relationship to to society. You have your Batman character who ends up related to this in some way, and part of the fun is kind of, if you're familiar with DC characters and mythology, kind of seeing the clever ways that these characters kind of manifest themselves in a medieval setting. And yeah, it's just fun. Great art. So it's Tom Taylor's the author, Yasmin Putri, the primary illustrator for those. But yeah, it was a fun kind of reimagining of ideas of these characters in a uniquely medieval setting. That was, yeah, it was a fun story, some twists, turns, mysteries, gorgeous artwork. And so it made me want to see more of that sort of thing, kind of reimagining uh, characters from one era, contemporary era, or some other era, into the past. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That appeals to me a lot. My brain is now whirling through all the other potential comic book universes that you could shift. Um, so for me, I was thinking it'd be really fun just to flip a switch, and all the people in Star Trek find themselves actually in a real version of this medieval universe. So when you set off on the Starship Enterprise, so you go through the different spheres, and you've got to um, hear the music of the spheres and dodge all these planets and deal with the prime mover and the fixed stars. Just be wonderful, just to see them having to reimagine themselves in that way. It could almost be one of those holodeck episodes that
Right.
they used to do
Yeah.
in the Next Generation, but that would be great fun. Thank you so much for talking to me about the discarded image. And so I hope, as a result, people don't discard it so much anymore, and will go back and re-examine it and find in it new, fresh sources of inspiration. Thank you very much, Jacob.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.